In 1943, the German Panther tank entered combat with a reputation that seemed decisive, even transformative, for German armored warfare. On paper, it was one of the most formidable tanks fielded during World War II, combining a high-velocity 75mm KWK 42 gun capable of penetrating Allied armor at ranges beyond 1,500 meters with thick, sloped frontal armor designed to deflect incoming fire. German planners expected it to counter the Soviet T-34 and re-establish armored superiority through long-range engagements where firepower and protection could be fully exploited. The Panther was engineered around distance, visibility, and frontal dominance, assuming that battles would be fought across open ground, where targets could be identified early and destroyed before they posed a serious threat. In such conditions, the tank performed as intended, using its gun accuracy and penetration to neutralize opponents before they closed the range. But armored warfare did not remain confined to open plains. As the war expanded into forests, hedgerows, villages, and dense urban terrain, engagement distances collapsed from kilometers to mere meters, and threats began to appear from multiple directions rather than directly ahead. Though close combat eliminated the Panther's reliance on long sight lines and reduced the time available to detect and respond to enemy movement. Its strengths were concentrated at the front, while its sides and rear were significantly less protected, creating vulnerabilities when opponents could maneuver around it or strike from concealed positions. The long barrel that provided superior muzzle velocity at distance became harder to manage in tight streets and wooded terrain where rapid repositioning and quick turret reaction were critical. In confined environments, battles were defined not only by armor thickness and gun power, but by reaction speed, mechanical reliability under stress, coordination with infantry, and the ability to handle threats emerging from unpredictable angles. The Panther was optimized for a specific type of armored duel, one that emphasized frontal engagement and controlled firing positions. When the battlefield shifted into environments that denied space and multiplied angles of attack, its design philosophy encountered conditions it had not been built to master. The tank that excelled in long-range combat increasingly faced situations where distance disappeared, and its performance in those circumstances revealed structural limitations that would shape its combat record throughout the remainder of the war. When the Panther first appeared in 1943, it addressed a problem that had shocked the German army on the Eastern Front: the unexpected effectiveness of the Soviet T-34. German Panzer III and IV models, which had performed well in earlier campaigns, struggled against the T-34's sloped armor and balanced firepower. The Panther was conceived as a direct response, designed to overmatch the T-34 at range and restore German armored dominance. Its 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun fired high-velocity rounds at roughly 935 meters per second, giving it superior penetration compared to most Allied tanks at typical engagement distances. At 1,000 meters, it could penetrate armor that would stop many competing guns. This meant that in open terrain, the Panther could often destroy an enemy tank before coming within effective return fire range. Protection reinforced this advantage. The Panther's frontal glacis plate was 80 millimeters thick and sharply sloped, significantly increasing its effective resistance to incoming rounds. Allied crews frequently reported difficulty penetrating the Panther from the front except at close range or with specialized ammunition. Combined with high-quality optics, the tank was optimized for long-distance engagements, where accurate first shots determined survival. German doctrine emphasized exactly this kind of fight: identify the enemy first, engage at maximum range, and exploit superior gunnery and armor geometry. On wide battlefields such as those found in parts of the Soviet Union, this approach could be devastating. Mobility, at least in theory, supported this design. powered by a Maybach HL230 engine producing around 700 horsepower. The Panther could reach road speeds of approximately 46 kilometers per hour. Its wide tracks distributed weight more effectively than earlier German designs, improving cross-country performance in mud and snow. On paper, it combined speed, firepower, and protection into a balanced package that appeared superior to the American M4 Sherman and competitive with late-war Soviet tanks. German reports and Allied intelligence assessments alike recognized the Panther as a serious threat in conventional armored engagements. Measured strictly by gun penetration tables, armor thickness charts, and maximum speed figures, the Panther seemed to represent the evolution of German tank design. It corrected earlier weaknesses and introduced advanced features that impressed even its adversaries. In long-range open-field combat, the scenario it was primarily built to fight, the Panther could impose its advantages with lethal efficiency. The problem was not that the tank lacked strength. The problem was that battlefield conditions increasingly demanded a different kind of strength. The Panther's strengths were real, but they were tied to specific engineering priorities that created trade-offs, especially in close terrain. Its long 75mm L70 gun, while highly effective at long range, extended far beyond the hull and required significant space to maneuver. In open fields, this posed no issue. In narrow streets or wooded areas, however, the length of the barrel limited flexibility. Rotating the turret or adjusting aim in confined spaces increased the risk of striking obstacles, reducing reaction speed in situations where seconds mattered. The same high-velocity design that delivered exceptional penetration also required a long recoil mechanism and precise alignment, reinforcing its orientation toward distance rather than rapid, short-range engagements. Armor distribution further reflected this design philosophy. The Panther's frontal armor was strong, but its side armor was only 40 to 50 millimeters thick on most variants. In long-range duels, enemy tanks typically engaged from the front, where the Panther's protection was most effective. In close combat, threats rarely presented themselves directly ahead. Infantry with anti-tank weapons, flanking tanks, and concealed guns often attacked from the sides or rear. The disparity between frontal and lateral protection meant that once an enemy closed distance or maneuvered into a favorable position, the Panther became significantly more vulnerable. This imbalance was not accidental. It was a calculated weight-saving decision to maintain mobility while maximizing frontal resistance. Turret traverse speed also depended heavily on engine revolutions. The Panther used a hydraulic traverse system powered by the engine, meaning that at low RPMs, the turret rotated more slowly. In open combat, crews could anticipate threats and maintain higher engine speeds while scanning the horizon. In tight urban fighting or ambush situations, sudden threats from unexpected angles required rapid turret adjustment. If the engine was not operating at higher revolutions, traverse response could lag at critical moments. Manual backup operation existed, but was significantly slower, placing additional strain on the crew during sudden engagements. Mechanical reliability compounded these challenges. Early Panthers suffered from significant issues with their final drives and transmission components. The tank weighed approximately 45 tons, pushing the limits of its drivetrain. In prolonged maneuvering, particularly in terrain that required frequent stopping, reversing, and pivoting, mechanical stress increased. Close combat environments demand rapid repositioning, short bursts of movement, and abrupt directional changes. The Panther's drivetrain, already operating near its design limits, was more vulnerable under these conditions than in steady, forward-oriented engagements. Visibility was another factor. Although equipped with quality optics for long-range targeting, close combat introduces visual complexity. Buildings, rubble, vegetation, and elevation changes create blind spots. The Panther's commander and gunner relied on vision blocks and periscopes, optimized for distance scanning. Detecting infantry armed with short-range anti-tank weapons within 30 to 50 meters required rapid scanning across multiple angles, something heavy armored vehicles inherently struggle to achieve. In environments where threats could emerge from basements, upper floors, or concealed ditches, limited peripheral awareness became a tactical liability. None of these characteristics made the Panther ineffective in its intended role. In long-range engagements across open terrain, the combination of firepower, optics, and frontal protection made it formidable. The difficulty arose when the battlefield removed distance as a buffer. The engineering decisions that maximize performance at range, long barrel, frontal armor bias, engine-dependent turret speed, weight-heavy drivetrain, became constraints when engagements occurred at close quarters. The Panther was not poorly designed. It was precisely designed for a type of combat that the war increasingly denied it. The Panther was built around the assumption that armored combat would be decided at range, in terrain that allowed space to maneuver and time to engage. German armored doctrine, refined during earlier campaigns in Poland, France, and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, emphasized coordinated movement across open ground supported by reconnaissance and long-range fire. In these scenarios, tanks operated with clear sight lines, predictable axes of advance, and enough distance to exploit superior gunnery before closing into vulnerable positions. The Panther's design reflected this expectation. It rewarded crews who could identify targets early, align their frontal armor toward threats, and destroy opponents before they entered effective firing range. By 1944, much of the war no longer followed that pattern. In Normandy, the bocage landscape divided the countryside into small enclosed fields, bordered by thick hedgerows and sunken lanes. The visibility was often reduced to under 100 meters. Tanks could not rely on long-range optics when terrain blocked sightlines at every turn. Movement became fragmented, and threats frequently emerged from concealed positions just beyond hedgerow gaps. In these conditions, the Panther's long-range advantage was neutralized before it could be used. Engagements began abruptly, and at short distance where side armor and reaction speed mattered more than ballistic superiority. Urban combat created even more restrictive conditions. Cities such as Caen, Warsaw, and later Budapest presented dense networks of narrow streets, rubble-filled intersections, and multi-story buildings that provided vertical firing positions. Tanks moving through such environments faced threats from basements, upper windows, alleyways, and rooftops. The Panther's armor was strongest at the front, yet in cities the danger rarely came from directly ahead. The infantry armed with anti-tank weapons could wait at corners or behind debris, striking from the side at distances of less than 30 meters. The ability to pivot quickly, reverse rapidly, and coordinate closely with infantry became more important than long-range penetration tables. Forested areas posed similar challenges. On the Eastern Front, particularly in later stages of the war, German armored units encountered increasingly defensive Soviet tactics in wooded terrain. Trees restricted movement, limited turret rotation arcs, and obscured lines of fire. Ambushes became common. In such environments, the Panther's wide hull and long gun could be liabilities when maneuvering between obstacles. The need for constant directional adjustment increased mechanical strain and slowed reaction time. Close combat environments compressed decision cycles. At 1,500 meters, a crew has seconds to observe, aim, and fire. At 50 meters, engagement becomes immediate and chaotic. Threats may not be armored vehicles at all, but infantry equipped with portable anti-tank weapons. The Panther's engineering prioritized frontal survivability and long-range lethality. It did not prioritize compact handling, rapid pivoting under stress, or all-angle protection. As the war shifted into terrain, where distance could no longer be assumed, the Panther increasingly operated outside the conditions for which it had been optimized. Where the mismatch between design intent and battlefield reality did not render the Panther useless. It remained dangerous and respected by Allied crews. But its effectiveness depended heavily on environment. In open country, it could impose its strengths. In confined, complex terrain, those strengths were diluted, and its structural vulnerabilities became more exposed. The first clear indications that the Panther struggled in close combat did not come from theoretical analysis, but from operational experience, particularly in Normandy after June 1944. German armored units expected that their long-range firepower would offset Allied numerical superiority. Instead, they encountered terrain that neutralized distance and forced engagements at unexpectedly short range. In the bocage, Allied forces frequently used hedgerows as concealed firing positions, allowing Sherman tanks and anti-tank teams to approach within a few dozen meters before initiating contact. The Panther's advantage in long-range penetration was irrelevant if the enemy could fire first from concealment at close range. Reports from Normandy describe situations where Panthers advancing through narrow lanes were struck from the flank before their crews could bring the main gun to bear. The long barrel that provided accuracy, at 1,500 meters, became awkward in confined spaces where sudden turns were required. When Allied tanks or anti-tank guns appeared at 50 to 100 meters, reaction time collapsed. Frontal armor remained strong, but side armor was far more vulnerable at these distances. Allied 75mm and 76mm guns, which struggled against the Panther frontally at range, were capable of penetrating side armor once flanking positions were achieved. Where urban fighting amplified these difficulties. In Warsaw, and later in other contested cities, Panthers were committed to street-level engagements where visibility was limited and threats came from multiple elevations. Infantry, with anti-tank weapons such as the American bazooka or the British Piat, could exploit the Panther's weaker side and rear armor. Soviet infantry frequently coordinated close assaults using satchel charges and anti-tank rifles in combination with artillery suppression. The Panther's turret, dependent on engine speed for rapid traverse, sometimes lagged when immediate response was required from unexpected angles. In dense terrain, a delay of even a few seconds could determine whether the tank fired first or absorbed the initial hit. Another recurring issue involved maneuver under pressure. Close combat demands rapid repositioning, quick reversals, and constant adjustment to avoid flanking threats. The Panther's transmission and final drive components were already operating near design limits due to the vehicle's weight of approximately 45 tons. Frequent short bursts of movement, pivot turns, and reverse maneuvers increased mechanical strain. Breakdowns during combat were not uncommon, and immobilized Panthers became high-priority targets for infantry and artillery. The tactical shock was not that the Panther was incapable of fighting at close range. It was that its performance dropped sharply once distance disappeared. Allied units learned that survival did not require outmatching the Panther's gun frontally at long range. It required compressing engagement distance, maneuvering into flanking positions, and exploiting terrain to deny the Panther the time and space it needed to use its strengths. In environments where reaction speed, coordination, and all-around awareness mattered more than ballistic dominance, the Panther's design philosophy faced its most serious test. Close combat did not just mean shorter, tank-versus-tank engagements. It meant infantry becoming a primary anti-armor threat. By 1944, Allied forces had fielded increasingly effective portable anti-tank weapons that were specifically designed to exploit side and rear vulnerabilities. The American M1, and later M9 bazooka, firing a shaped charge warhead, did not rely on velocity in the same way as conventional tank guns. At ranges under 100 meters, it could penetrate armor thickness that would otherwise resist standard kinetic rounds. The British Piat operated on a similar principle, using a spigot mortar system to deliver a high-explosive anti-tank charge capable of defeating moderate armor when fired from concealed urban or wooded positions. In open terrain, infantry attempting to approach a Panther would likely be detected and suppressed long before reaching effective range. In hedgerows, forests, and cities, the concealment worked in the attacker's favor. Infantry teams could position themselves at choke points, corners, or along likely movement routes, and wait until the tank entered a vulnerable zone. At 30 to 50 meters, the Panther's superior frontal protection offered little reassurance if the shot struck the thinner side armor. Once hit, even if not fully destroyed, the tank could suffer track damage, engine compartment fires, or crew disorientation, making it susceptible to follow-up attacks. The Soviet tactics on the Eastern Front demonstrated similar principles. Red Army units frequently deployed infantry, with anti-tank grenades, magnetic mines, and satchel charges in combination with artillery barrages designed to suppress German supporting units. The goal was not necessarily to duel Panthers frontally, but to isolate them, force them into constrained positions, and attack from multiple angles. In urban fighting, the upper floors and basements provided vertical attack vectors that heavy armor could not easily counter. Tanks are inherently optimized for horizontal threats. Vertical exposure complicates defensive positioning. The Panther's side armor, typically 40 to 50 millimeters, could be penetrated at close range by shaped charges and certain anti-tank guns firing from favorable angles. While Germany introduced side skirts, Schürzen, to provide limited protection against anti-tank rifles and shaped charges, these were not comprehensive solutions. They added weight and maintenance complexity without fundamentally altering the tank's vulnerability profile in tight terrain. Furthermore, infantry coordination required strong combined arms doctrine. When Panthers operated without adequate infantry screening, especially during rapid maneuvers or counterattacks, they became more exposed to close assault. Close combat shifts the center of gravity from long-range gunnery to combined arms coordination and situational awareness. The Panther's effectiveness depended heavily on supporting infantry and proper positioning. When forced into environments where infantry threats dominated and engagement distances were compressed, its advantages diminished. It was not enough to possess a powerful gun and thick frontal armor. Survival increasingly depended on all-angle protection and the ability to detect and neutralize small, mobile teams armed with compact anti-tank weapons. In this domain, the Panther faced pressure that its original design parameters had not fully anticipated. Beyond tactical vulnerability, close combat exposed another critical weakness in the Panther: mechanical reliability under high-stress maneuvering. The Panther weighed approximately 44 to 45 tons, depending on variant, yet it was powered by a Maybach HL-230 engine, producing around 700 horsepower. On paper, this provided respectable mobility. In practice, the drivetrain, particularly the final drives and transmission, operated near the limits of what the components could sustain. Where early production Panthers suffered frequent breakdowns, especially during the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where a significant percentage were lost to mechanical failure rather than enemy fire. Close combat environments magnified these stresses. Unlike long-range engagements, which allowed steady forward movement and controlled firing positions, urban and forest fighting demanded constant adjustments. Tanks had to stop abruptly, reverse quickly, pivot in confined streets, and maneuver around rubble or natural obstacles. Each sharp turn or sudden acceleration increased strain on the gearbox and final drive assemblies. These components were already known weak points. Repeated stress in tight terrain accelerated wear and increased the risk of immobilization. Reverse speed presented another limitation. The Panther's reverse capability was relatively slow compared to some Allied tanks, reducing its ability to withdraw rapidly after firing. In open terrain, this mattered less, as distance provided a buffer. In close quarters, where anti-tank teams could appear within tens of meters, the ability to quickly reposition or retreat behind cover became critical. A delay of even a few seconds could expose the tank's vulnerable side armor to incoming fire. Limited reverse performance constrained tactical flexibility during sudden engagements. Fuel consumption and maintenance demands further complicated close combat operations. The Panther's engine required careful upkeep, and its complexity meant that field repairs were not always straightforward. In dense, urban fighting or defensive actions where supply lines were under pressure, maintaining mechanical readiness became more difficult. Immobilized Panthers, whether disabled by mechanical issues or minor damage, were hard to recover in restricted terrain, and often had to be abandoned or destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. When the interaction between mechanical limits and tactical conditions created a compounding effect. Close combat did not simply increase the chance of being hit, it increased the frequency of high-stress maneuvers that strained vulnerable components. A tank optimized for forward-oriented, long-distance combat was forced into environments that demanded constant directional change and rapid repositioning. Under these conditions, mechanical reliability became as decisive as armor thickness or gun penetration. The Panther's design achieved impressive performance within its intended operational envelope, but when pushed into sustained close-quarters fighting, its mechanical systems were tested in ways that revealed structural limitations. As reports accumulated from Normandy, the Eastern Front, and urban engagements across Europe, German command understood that the Panther's vulnerabilities in close combat could not be ignored. The tank remained valuable, but adjustments were necessary to mitigate its exposure in confined terrain. One of the most visible modifications was the continued use and refinement of Schürzen, thin armor skirts mounted along the hull sides. When these were intended primarily to counter anti-tank rifles and shape-charge weapons by disrupting the jet of penetrating force before it reached the main armor. While Schürzen offered some protection, they were not a comprehensive solution. They could be damaged or torn off during maneuvering through tight streets or forested areas, and they did not fundamentally alter the Panther's side armor thickness. Tactical adaptation also became more pronounced. German doctrine increasingly emphasized combined arms coordination, pairing Panthers closely with infantry to screen for anti-tank teams in urban and wooded terrain. Infantry units were tasked with clearing buildings, hedgerows, and potential ambush points before armored vehicles advanced. When properly executed, this coordination reduced the risk of sudden close-range attacks. However, by late 1944 and 1945, Germany faced manpower shortages and declining training standards. Maintaining ideal combined arms discipline became more difficult as experienced units were depleted and replacements had limited preparation. Positioning adjustments were also implemented. Panthers were often deployed in defensive roles, where their frontal armor and long-range gun could be maximized. Hull-down positions behind rubble, ridgelines, or prepared obstacles allowed crews to expose only the strongest part of the tank. In urban defense, the Panthers were sometimes used as static strongpoints rather than maneuver elements, effectively serving as heavily armed bunkers. This approach reduced mechanical strain and limited exposure to flanking fire, but sacrificed mobility and operational flexibility. Despite these adaptations, structural constraints remained. The Panther's weight continued to stress its drivetrain during rapid maneuvering. Its turret traverse still depended on engine speed, limiting reaction under sudden threat. Side armor remained significantly thinner than frontal protection, leaving persistent vulnerability when enemy forces achieved flanking angles. The battlefield itself was not static. Allied forces increasingly integrated infantry anti-tank weapons, artillery coordination, and air support to pressure German armored formations. Adjustments in tactics could mitigate risk, but could not fully compensate for a design philosophy centered on long-range dominance. By the final year of the war, the Panther was still a formidable tank in open engagements, but it was increasingly committed to environments that reduced its advantages. German adaptation improved survivability in certain situations, Yet it did not transform the Panther into a close combat specialist. The limitations observed in Normandy and on the Eastern Front reflected deeper design priorities that could not be reversed without fundamental redesign. Tactical modifications and operational discipline extended effectiveness, but they did not eliminate the underlying mismatch between the tank's original purpose and the evolving conditions of late-war combat. The Panther was not a failure in absolute terms. In long-range engagements across open ground, it remained one of the most dangerous tanks of the war. Its gun could penetrate most Allied armor at distances where return fire was ineffective, and its frontal protection made direct assault costly. But close combat revealed a broader truth about armored warfare in World War II. Technical superiority in one environment does not guarantee dominance in another. The Panther was designed around range, their frontal engagement, and deliberate positioning. As the war moved into dense terrain, shattered cities, and constrained battlefields, those assumptions lost reliability. Armored combat in 1944 and 1945 increasingly revolved around compression. Engagement distances shortened, infantry anti-tank weapons proliferated, air power and artillery coordination tightened the battlefield. Tanks were no longer dueling in isolation across kilometers of open terrain. They were operating inside layered systems of infantry, engineers, and mobile anti-armor teams. Under these conditions, reaction speed, mechanical resilience, and all-angle awareness became as important as penetration charts and frontal armor thickness. The Panther's strengths did not disappear, but their relative value declined in environments where distance could not be maintained. The struggle of the Panther in close combat was not simply about thinner side armor or drivetrain strain, and it was about design philosophy meeting battlefield evolution. German armored doctrine and engineering emphasized long-range firepower to restore superiority after the shock of encountering the T-34. That approach produced a tank optimized for a specific tactical problem. By the time the Panther was fielded in significant numbers, the tactical landscape had shifted. Urban fighting, hedgerow warfare, and defensive infantry tactics reduced the effectiveness of range-based dominance. The broader lesson extends beyond a single vehicle. Modern armored warfare increasingly rewards adaptability over specialization. A tank, built primarily for frontal, long-distance engagements, faces limitations when the battlefield becomes multidirectional and compressed. The Panther demonstrated how quickly conditions can outpace engineering assumptions. It remained formidable when allowed to fight on its own terms. But war rarely allows fixed conditions. As World War II progressed, terrain and combined arms integration reshaped how tanks were used, and vehicles that depended heavily on distance found that distance was no longer guaranteed. In that shift, the Panther's difficulties in close combat became less about isolated weakness and more about systemic change. Firepower and armor remained important, but flexibility, coordination, and reliability in constrained environments increasingly defined effectiveness. The battlefield had evolved. And the Panther, designed for a different set of expectations, had to operate within a reality that no longer prioritized the strengths it was built to exploit.